Welcome everyone to the final Diplomat webinar of 2020, and I'm sure everyone is as thrilled as I am that we're this close to the end of 2020. I'm Shannon Tiezzi, the editor-in-chief of the Diplomat, and in my previous incarnation here, I was our China editor. So I'm going to be discussing China and Northeast Asia today. We are also joined by Sebastian Strangio, who is our Southeast Asia editor. He'll obviously be talking Southeast Asia. And then we have Abhijnan Rej, who is our Defense and Security editor. He's going to be talking South Asia, as well as I'm sure some geopolitical flashpoints for us. And then Catherine Putz, who is our managing editor, but also our Central Asia guru, who is going to be discussing Central Asia. And yeah, this is going to be a informal, but hopefully very illuminating look back on 2020 as we try to get our minds clear about all of the things that happened this year, because it's been a lot. So we're each going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A at the end. For those of us who are joining live via Zoom, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A bubble. So you can just click there at any point during the webinar, type your questions in, and I'll gather them and pitch questions to my colleagues and I guess to myself as we get to the Q&A point. So I will kick us off with a look back at 2020 in Northeast Asia. And the big event, obviously, COVID-19, which emerged, although that is apparently a controversial thing to say, in Northeast Asia. About this time last year, actually, we got the first official confirmation right at the end of December of 2019. So obviously, COVID has spiraled from there to hit the entire world, but I want to talk specifically about how we're still seeing the ramifications in terms of geopolitics and foreign policy of COVID-19. Big one, I think, is what it has done to China's relationship with the world. You had the huge blow to its reputation from the early handling of COVID, which to a lot of people hammered home the problems that human rights activists have with the Chinese government. You have an opaque system that doesn't handle criticism and tends to cover up problems. In this case, unfortunately, the problem was an incredibly contagious disease that has since spread around the entire world. That combined with a really defensive reaction from the Chinese government, they seem to have adopted the mantra that the best defense is a good offense when it comes to diplomacy. And so we saw the birth of what's been called wolf warrior diplomacy, where you have these Chinese diplomats really going on the offensive and not mincing any words about how displeased and angry they are with certain other countries and certain government officials. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is a very frequent target. Now, that being said, despite the strained ties that this has caused for China with many of the developed countries in the world, Beijing clearly thinks of the pandemic as an opportunity for itself. Within a few months, China had mostly contained the pandemic, and that is a huge stark contrast, particularly to where I am right now in the United States, where we are far from being under control. And Beijing seems to think that actually this is going to be a net gain for it. And that's part of the reason why it's going on the offensive. It's trying to consolidate these perceived gains and to make sure that it is going to actually come out benefiting from this event that at the beginning of the year, a lot of people were saying, could this be a make or break moment for the Chinese Communist Party? I think it's pretty clear now that the answer is no. And instead, China is trying to make this a make or break moment for its global leadership in the world. Now, the end result of these two factors, one is China's worsening image in the world, and the other is China pushing harder than ever to take on a leadership role, is that ties with the United States are strained almost to the breaking point as we head into the end of 2020. And I want to really hammer home the difference between now and just a year ago, December 2019. Things were still tense, obviously. We're in the middle of a trade war. but they weren't this bad. The trade deal was about to be signed between China and the United States. There was a lot of optimism that this would be at least give the two sides a little bit of breathing room, even though all of the structural issues, geopolitical factors between the two were still there. It's really kind of hard to wrap our head around everything that's gone wrong since then in the past year. You had consulates closing, which would have been unthinkable a while ago. You have each side slapping sanctions on each other's officials. You have journalists being expelled by both countries, visa restrictions in the United States on Chinese officials. The relationship is at the worst point that it has been since we normalized ties. So, that's, I think, all kind of obvious to people, but I don't want to overlook the story because it is one of the big stories. Number two, the Hong Kong national security law, which is also part of this China story, but I think deserves its own shout out. We went from mass protests of 2019 to the mass arrests of 2020. The Legislative Council no longer has an opposition to speak of in it. Doing popular protests now risks being thrown in jail. Hong Kong is almost unrecognizable from the city that it was in 2019. And as part of that, all of the changes that Hong Kong's people had come out in force to protest against, to reject, are now going to be coming by fiat from Beijing. It started with the national security law, which there's originally the Hong Kong legislature tried to pass it, and massive protests forced them to back down. So patriotic education, which was the subject of a protest movement in 2012, looks like it's going to be the next thing to follow. And this is putting human rights in China back at the top of the foreign policy agenda for a lot of other countries in a way that we hadn't seen before. So that's another thing that really defined 2020 for me, and I think it's going to continue echo into 2021. And my third event would be the leadership change in Japan. We all gotten quite used to having Prime Minister Abe. He had been the Prime Minister for nearly 8 full years. So it's easy to forget that before that, Japan had a revolving door of Prime Ministers, each one lasted about a year or so. Is that going to be the case now? Are we going to see that again? And what will that mean for Japan's foreign policy, particularly as Suga is not known as a foreign policy maven, and he's going to have his hands full, like every other leader, in trying to rebuild his country's economy, and his own particular stated emphasis is reforming the way the Japanese government works. So with those two priorities in mind, even if we don't see a foreign policy change, we might see a change incidentally just by virtue of it being a lower foreign policy focus for him. And one more point on the Japanese leadership transition. Abe was a very polarizing figure, particularly for regional partners, China, South Korea. His visit to Yasukuni Shrine was never really forgotten, and supposedly that's something that Suga, who's the current prime minister, had warned against doing. So he's seen as less of a nationalist, less of a loaded figure. This opens the door for reconciliation over some of these historical issues. We haven't actually seen any signs of this yet, but it's still early in his tenure. So that's something that the optimist in me will be keeping an eye on. All right, so that's my quick rundown of Northeast Asia. So I'm going to kick it over to Sebastian to handle Southeast Asia.
All right, thank you, Shannon. Well, as everywhere else, 2020 has been a crowded year in Southeast Asia. It's really hard to imagine where we were a year ago. A large part of that, of course, has to do with the coronavirus and how it's transformed perceptions of China and recalibrated nations' relationships with it, both for good and for bad, I suppose. The first major trend, I think, of 2020 that is likely to continue to, echo through into the coming years is the fate of the Mekong River. 2020 was the year in which the impact of Chinese dam building on the upper reaches of the Mekong really broke through into, it became a subject of more attention than ever before. And the U.S. government has funded research that was published in April that shows that the Chinese dams on the upper reaches of the river have withheld large amounts of water from downstream countries. And of course, at a time of climate change, increasing drought, increasing pressures on the Mekong and its resources. This has had, arguably a very significant effect on the nations downstream. And so the findings of this report, which were produced by a group called Eyes on Earth and released in April of this year, these findings have been picked up by the U.S. government as, in order to sort of discredit China and attempt to erode the strategic gains that China has made in the nations of mainland Southeast Asia through which the Mekong flows. And so we've seen the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and other senior U.S. officials, pick up these findings and use them to portray China as a bullying and inconsiderate partner of the lower Mekong nations. So 2020 could well be the year in which the Mekong emerged as a region or the focus of serious strategic competition. And I should add, by way of addendum, that of course, harks back to the role that the river played during the original Cold War, when the conflicts of the region, made it a subject of intense superpower competition. The second trend, I think it's impossible to look past COVID-19. I mean, Southeast Asia was the first region that saw cases outside of China. In fact, I was living in northern Thailand at the time, and in Chiang Mai, where I previously lived, that was the first case that was identified in Thailand, and hence anywhere outside of China. And at the time, the debate, much of the commentary seemed to suggest that this demonstrated Southeast Asia's over-reliance on China. The fact that there were so many tourism links, transport links, economic links, left the region exposed to a crisis like the coronavirus that arose within China. And there was talk about how this might act as a prompt for Southeast Asia to reduce its reliance on China, something that, of course, the region has been, for a long time has sought to do in one way or the other. 6 months later, though, and things look quite different as the virus scythed through the Western world, and in the case of the United States and certain European countries, laid bare the unpreparedness and the political divisions that are currently plaguing these countries. Things began to look a lot different. China's relatively rapid recovery from handling and control of the virus has enabled it to position itself in Southeast Asia as the partner of choice in terms of escaping from the economic recession that has been prompted and triggered by COVID-19. And so, I think that in a year on, it's clear that COVID-19 has actually underscored the structural foundation of Southeast Asia's relationship with China, which is its geographic proximity. China has used this crisis to depict itself as an inevitable partner in the region's attempts to avoid economic and hence political crisis as a result of the pandemic. And so I think 2020, will probably be looked back as a year in which China's influence, in the region deepened. Whether that is a permanent shift or simply a temporary result of the pandemic, we'll have to wait and see. This hints as well at the third trend that I want to highlight for 2020, which focuses on Thailand and the protests that have been unfolding there. Now, there's two ways in which we can look at this. The first is as a remarkable domestic development within Thailand. Thailand has been no stranger to large-scale street protests of various kinds in recent decades. But one thing that makes this current wave of protests so interesting and so controversial domestically is their willingness to assail what was once an untouchable institution in Thailand, which is to say the country's monarchy. The student activists who have led the recent protests in Thailand have rightly identified the monarchy as the linchpin of the Thailand's lopsided distributions of wealth and power, and the sort of and as the pretext for the military's perpetual involvement in Thai politics. Whether, of course, they succeed in reforming this institution remains to be seen. I think that the potential for this demand to alienate a large portion of the Thai public who have been brought up to revere the monarchy raises some questions about whether, it'll achieve its aims. But I think, this represents a very important turning point for Thailand, or a very important threshold. Whether that will turn in the direction of more popular sovereignty and accountability and democracy remains to be seen. But another reason why this is important in the context of 2020 is that it demonstrates the potential political impacts that the pandemic might have. The past episodes of economic crisis in Southeast Asia, particularly the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, quickly dominoed over into political crises in Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia. And so with the region facing a much more serious economic recession due to the pandemic, Thailand in 2020 may give us a foretaste of what's to come in the years ahead.
Great, thank you, Sebastian. It's tough to outline a whole year in just a few minutes, but that was a lot of food for thought. Okay, we're going to move on to Abhijnan in South Asia. So take it away. Tell us what happened in 2020. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Shannon. I think there are three clear trends that emerged, and all of these three trends are in many ways interlocking and they're connected with one another. I would say the first big trend, obviously, is China as a major player in continental South Asia, right? So if you look at the discussions that we have had, even after Doklam, in the India-China standoff in Doklam in 2017, generally the concern always had been, at least in the Western think tank circuits or media, about China in maritime South Asia and its plans in Sri Lanka and Maldives, etc. This year we saw China really emerge as a major continental South Asia player. Obviously, the big sub-story there is what's going on between India and China in Ladakh. So just kind of quickly recap the story, which is, I think, familiar to many. We have had a standoff with the PLA in eastern Ladakh. The Indian Army has been in a military standoff across a wide frontage, by the way, in Ladakh since May. There was a military clash between Indian forces and Chinese forces middle of June that saw casualties for the first time since the 70s on both sides. 20 Indian soldiers died. Unspecified Chinese casualties, which was a very serious downturn in India-China relations since the two countries fought a war in 1962, I'd say. And of course, then you have some Indian military pushback in August using a very secretive Indian Special Operations Forces, the Special Frontier Force, which is, by the way, manned by ethnic Tibetans mostly. So that carried some symbolism. Multiple rounds of diplomatic, military, political talks have gone nowhere. Right now, things are cold in Ladakh because it's very cold in Ladakh, right? But we'll get some sense of where things are going. I'm not very optimistic about that. But even beyond the India-China situation in Ladakh, you see a scenario where you have China in Nepal playing a very big role. Concerns have risen in several capitals, especially in New Delhi, about what role China is playing in Nepali politics. As you all know, the Nepalese president dismissed the parliament on Sunday. And so the Oli government, on the request of the Oli government, there was some indications that the Chinese ambassador in Kathmandu is playing a very significant role in the background, trying to patch things up within the Nepali Communist Party. But of course, also about Bhutan, right? Because you have a situation where you get reports that China has resumed construction inside Bhutan, which could imperil the India-Bhutan-China trijuncture. Second trend, I would say, would be U.S. and partners in maritime South Asia, because that is also something we saw. The Quad is doing well, I would see. I think it's done a lot better than what many would have expected. We have seen a ministerial meeting in Tokyo in October. For the first time, since 2007, you have Australia in the Malabar exercise after 13 years. So even though the Malabar exercise, which is India, US, Japan, and now Australia coming in this year, it's not a Quad exercise in a formal sense. It just gives an impression that the Quad is contemplating acquiring a more clear political military shape. Many other trilaterals, I would say, have consolidated around the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In particular, you have Australia, France, India, France, Australia, India, sorry, trilateral that has taken off now, admittedly at not a very senior level, but there's some potential there. France has joined the Indian Ocean Rim Association just a couple of days ago. So a lot of movement there. But of course, you also see some difficulties, right? So one difficulty that became very clear was with the U.S. approach, or the Trump administration's approach to maritime South Asia. So you saw Mr. Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, visit Sri Lanka and Maldives, and he got very different treatment in both capitals. I would say there was a lot of skepticism in Colombo while he was there. The Sri Lankans all but snubbed him. Malay, of course, under Ibrahim Soli, he got a warmer reception, I would say. But I think the biggest story when it comes to maritime South Asia is the role India would play going forward, and its own maritime heft and economic heft. And so I'd say that brings me to my third trend, which is what's going on with the Indian economy, especially after the pandemic. Because without that economic heft, a lot of these things are just geopolitical scribblings that do not necessarily go anywhere. As you know, India has been hit very, very badly economically. I mean, it's probably one of the biggest economies that has performed so badly in terms of the pandemic. Some of these economic problems, of course, were pre-existing. They predate the pandemic. We are now in the middle of a historic recession. I'm literally using a term, a technical recession, but using a term that the Reserve Bank has used in the past. The economy is expected over the year to contract by about 9%, depending on who you ask. So what Mr. Modi has done is he's kind of reverted back to what always happens when things go wrong with the Indian economy, which is autarky, which is protectionism. So we see these talks about a self-reliant India. We still don't know what that actually means, other than saying we're going to import less and export more. Well, we don't know how that's going to pan out. But I think all of this economic downturn for India, if it continues, it will have certain foreign policy ramifications. And perhaps it could lead to questions in capitals like DC about what is India's staying power at the end of the day, and whether also India's economic downturn leads to greater questions around human rights issues under the Modi government, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Abhi. And Katie is going to wrap up our very quick overview of Asia in 2020. So take it away, Katie.
All right, so I'm going to outline sort of three processes in Central Asia and Afghanistan, which I also cover. I think the first of which is a pretty obvious one, which is the Afghan peace process. As many people will have hopefully heard by now, there was a deal settled between the U.S. government and the Taliban on Leap Day in 2020, so February 29th. And it, among other things, set out a timeline for the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that timeline technically runs until May 2021. That deal also very optimistically set March 10th as the day for intra-Afghan talks to begin, talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. That didn't actually happen. Those talks began on September 12th, and just recently, after about 3 months, the two sides were able to agree on a 3-page document which laid out the rules and procedures for negotiating. So we haven't really even entered the actual negotiating phase. At this point, the two sides have preliminary agendas that they've kind of gone back to their corners with, and the plan is for talks to start again. I think January 5th was the date that I most recently saw. There is some agitation on the Afghan side to move the talks from Doha, which is where the Taliban have a political office, back to Afghanistan. I don't know if the Taliban's going to bite on that one, but the hope is they'll start talking again in January on an agenda. And the preliminary agendas on both sides are very, very far apart. Just as an illustration, the Afghan government really places a ceasefire right at the top, and the Taliban has that as like the conclusion. So there's a lot of work to be done. I'm not tremendously hopeful with that, but it's you can't really argue that 2020 has not been the greatest progress the Afghan peace process has seen in the last 19 years, but we're still extremely far from actual progress. In the meantime, the United States is planning to draw down to about 2,500 troops by January 15th, just in time for Joe Biden to be inaugurated. At this juncture, we're not entirely certain how the incoming administration is going to handle the outgoing administration's Afghanistan strategy. There is that February 2020 deal that set out that timeline, but plenty of analysts have pointed out that the Taliban has not necessarily held up all of its side of the bargain. So there's plenty of room to say, the conditions have not been met, so the withdrawal can't happen on the timetable. There's also plenty of impetus to just get out, so we shall see. I'm going to leave that there and move to what I promised my colleague Abhi I would try to explain today, which is the political turmoil in Kyrgyzstan. I could talk for hours and still not fully explain it, so I'm going to give the short version. If you want to know more, I've written approximately 6,000 articles about it. In essence, what happened is Kyrgyzstan had a parliamentary election at the beginning of October, and the results of that election, there were 16 parties that contested the election. 4 cleared the 7% national threshold, 2 of which split about 50% of the vote, which is just astronomically high in Kyrgyz politics. And those 2 parties, one was associated with the then sitting president, Sooronbay Jeenbekov, and the other was associated with the family of Rainbek Matraimov. So Matraimov, as an aside, is most recently in the news because the United States designated him under the Global Magnitsky Act for corruption. So he is a very divisive figure, has been at the center of a lot of corruption reports in Kyrgyzstan. And the fact that these 2 parties essentially bought their way into winning the election sparked protests. There were massive allegations of vote buying. It was just a very, very dirty contest. There were protests immediately after. Kyrgyzstan has overthrown now 3 governments, but 2 governments, once in 2005, 2010, and October 5th, people were out in the streets again. In the chaos of the protests that first day, a group of politicians who were sitting in jail were freed. Most of them returned to prison, but one that did not return to prison was a gentleman by the name of Sadar Japarov. He had been in jail on kidnapping charges since 2017. Was freed and within a week became prime minister. And so as prime minister, with lots of support in the streets, pressured the president into resigning. Sooronbay Jeenbekov resigned in mid-October, and within about a week and a half of being in prison, Japarov went from being in prison to being prime minister and acting president. He ended up resigning in mid-November because he wants to run for actual president. Kyrgyzstan now has a presidential election set for January 10th, and it also has a referendum set for January 10th. And the question for the referendum, it has shifted from being, it was going to be a referendum on amendments to the Constitution, and now it is just the question of what kind of government do the Kyrgyz want. Do they want the presidential system or do they want a parliamentary system? So we shall see what they decide. In the meantime, we still have no idea when the rerun of the parliamentary elections will happen. The results were annulled after the protests, so the current parliament is way past its expiration date and is making a lot of massive changes. So there's sort of the Kyrgyzstan has always been talked about as this island of democracy in Central Asia, and it's really, really losing that crown amid sort of these shenanigans. There's a lot more to it. About every day something changes in Kyrgyzstan on this front, but January 10th is sort of what the next point we're watching for. And then I'm going to close out by talking about something that probably deserves more time to discuss, but the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic in Central Asia is going to be pretty bad, and it can't be understated. Sort of on top of the slowdown in world travel, depressed oil and gas prices, a recession in Russia, all of these things add up to poor economic conditions in Central Asia. The sort of most painful point for this is labor migration. Labor migrants in Central Asia tend to travel seasonally, and most of that did not happen this year. Just to illustrate that, according to the World Bank, remittances from Russia to Tajikistan declined 20% in the first quarter of 2020 and 41% in the second quarter, and I can't really think that the third and fourth quarters are going to be much better. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan rank consistently among the top remittance-dependent countries in the world. And so the inability of really the most vulnerable in society, some of the poorest families, to send their members abroad to work and send money home, not being able to do that has been a really sharp blow. And I think the economic situation in Central Asia was not great, and then it's really bad, and I don't think it's going to get better, and I do think that will ultimately have political consequences, which are sort of difficult to predict because we don't have the normal mechanisms of democracies where if you don't like the way the government is running the economy, so you vote for the other guy. That's not really how it works. So we'll have to see what the sort of tertiary effects of the economic pain is, but there definitely is that economic pain. And I will stop my quick Central Asia hour there. I hope I satisfied Abby's request for a summary, and turn it back to Shannon.
All right, so a whole year in 30 minutes, quite an accomplishment, especially when that year is 2020. So it looks like we have a question. So Sebastian, I'll kick this one to you. 2020 in the Philippines, are there any events that jump out to you, particularly regarding, I'm assuming regional partners could mean the rest of Southeast Asia, but also other countries as well, and also South China Sea and the China issue. Anything stand out for you on that front?
Well, I think, the main changes in Philippine relations with the United States and of course with China have really took place in the early years of Rodrigo Duterte's administration. One thing that was notable this year was Duterte's, in his UN speech to the UN General Assembly a couple of months ago, affirmed his government's commitment to the 2016 arbitral ruling that ruled against most of China's claims and in favor of the Philippines in the case that was brought in 2013 by his predecessor, President Aquino. This was notable because it signaled, the administration's sort of rebalancing, I suppose, away from China toward its traditional security partner, the United States. I just think I would always caution about taking anything that Duterte says at face value, though. Officials in his administration later backpedaled on some of the comments that he'd made at the UN General Assembly. And I think that in the longer term, the most significant thing to look for is the next presidential election, in which allies of Duterte are likely to run and stand a fairly good chance of winning. Another 6-year sort of Duterte-esque administration is probably likely to have more of an impact on that will be the big thing that determines the longer term fate of the U.S.-Philippine alliance. But I do think, it's the 2020 has presented the same sort of flip-flopping and ambiguity on the part of Duterte and his administration. And there's not too much we can read into it. But I do think that one could perhaps, observe some, a certain degree of, recalibration in its policy toward China and the United States. But I predict that this will, this ambiguity will continue to the end of Duterte's term, and then whatever happens at the next election will probably have a greater say on the longer term health of the alliance.
So we've been talking a lot about COVID-19, and it's caused a lot of problems for governments all around the world. But I'm wondering, are there examples of countries that might have found a silver lining to COVID? And in my mind, Taiwan really stands out in that regard. For one thing, they've handled the pandemic extraordinarily well, which has really drawn positive international attention to them. And it's also drawn attention to the fact that they are excluded from the UN structure, and particularly from the World Health Organization. So you've seen a lot more governments being vocal about how Taiwan needs to be included in the WHO, which has long been a priority of its government to be reinvited back to the World Health Organization's annual meeting. And also, as much as the government on Taiwan would prefer it not be this way, I suspect, Taiwan is always kind of coupled with China. And so as China's image worsens with a lot of the developed world, think the United States, Europe, Australia, also, India, as Abhi was outlining for us earlier, there's a corresponding rise in Taiwan stock, because if countries have a frayed relationship with Beijing, they're more willing, sometimes eager to embrace Taiwan. So that's an example of a country in Northeast Asia that I think has found some silver linings from 2020. Can you guys think of any others, I guess is my question.
Ooh, it's a difficult one. I would say that the Vietnamese have similarly handled COVID very well, and they've benefited they've benefited from a transfer of the relocation of manufacturing bases from China, which was not caused by the pandemic, but has been furthered by the pandemic and the sort of the increasing Western focus on supply chain resiliency and diversification away from China as a manufacturing base. Vietnam, it's really interesting in East and Southeast Asia how the COVID success stories cut across regime type to such a dramatic degree. You have two one-party communist dictatorships which have been very effective at establishing control over the virus, even though China's, there were key missteps in the early stages which allowed the virus to escape from the epicenter around Wuhan. And then, of course, you have Taiwan, and which sort of provides evidence for the opposite case, which might suggest that regime type is not the main determinant in these cases. But in any event, Vietnam, I think, will emerge. It's the only nation in Southeast Asia that will post a positive growth rate, or is projected to post a positive growth rate in 2020. And I think that, what we're seeing is Vietnam rapidly catching up with the more developed, the tiger economies of Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, and the Philippines. And I think that over the decade to come, we're likely to see Vietnam creep up the rankings, and by the end of the 2030s, it could well be one of the most significant powers in Southeast Asia.
Sebastian's remarks just gave me some thoughts in terms of supply chain resilience and a silver lining. And I often think about a scenario, sort of a counterfactual, where you have the India-China standoff in Ladakh, but you don't have the pandemic going on in the background, right? How would India's responses and China's responses be shaped? And I think what happened is that the pandemic gave the Indian government an opening to act against China or diversify its economic relationships away from China, really participate in supply chain relocation. All of them, at least in the minds of people in the South Bloc, are retaliatory steps for whatever is going on in Ladakh. And I think that could only happen because you had the pandemic going on in the background. You have this global or at least regional conversations around supply chain de-risking, resilience. So depending on who you ask or whose silver lining it is, I think at least for the Modi government, the pandemic offered that opening where the pandemic helped it take certain geopolitical steps.
All right, Katie, I'm assuming this has not been a win for any country since invasion.
I guess the silver lining is really a little bit of a gray cloud, but it's not a total downpour. Is that at least 3 of the Central Asian countries I think took fairly reasonable steps early on when they first recorded cases in March. Tajikistan hemmed and hawed for about a month and a half before recognized the pandemic existed, and Turkmenistan continues to attest to this day that it has absolutely no cases of coronavirus. So I guess the silver lining is that it has not been as bad as I think some of us thought it could get. Whether this is a product of Central Asia's relative isolation or more spread out populations, I can't pin why it has not been as terrible, but that's not saying much. It's been a pretty terrible year for the people of Central Asia, and that's the best I've got on that one.
That's fair enough. So we have a question from our audience about Russia-China relations, which is a good one. Russia-China relations is always an interesting topic. I would say 2020 has been very similar to what we had seen in the past, only more so. And what I mean by that is Russia and China have a very close relationship at the government level, the top political level, and things get a little murkier when you get to the people-to-people level. The warmth really isn't there to the extent that Putin and Xi seem to have warm feelings for each other. It's not exactly reciprocated by the average Russian and the average Chinese. So we saw this in 2020. Russia and China, particularly amid the worsening tensions between the United States and China, have really banded together even more so. More joint statements on issues from, outer space, anti-militarization, to pandemic cooperation, to, how to approach the North Korea issue. They both are advocating for reducing sanctions there. So very high level political cooperation there. But the pandemic caused some issues on the people-to-people level that I don't think we can entirely discount having an impact on the relationship, although you can certainly overstate it, and I don't want to do that either. When the pandemic first emerged, there was a lot of xenophobia in Russia, and you had reports of Chinese people, basically being racially profiled and rounded up for detention and questioning in Moscow, pulled off public buses and things like that. Which caused a little bit of a backlash in China, of course, before the censors jumped in to stop people from talking about it. And then actually you had the reverse. After China got the pandemic under control things were looking bad in Russia, you had outbreaks in Chinese cities along the border. And a lot of Chinese were blaming Russians, essentially, for bringing the disease into China then. So that just kind of highlights there are some frictions there at the people-to-people level that I'm sure both governments wish were not there and that they didn't have to deal with. But given that both countries have a very centralized and not very responsive to the people, frankly, systems, how much that is going to impact their relationship is very much an open question. But I do think it's something to pay attention to. All right, we have another question for Sebastian. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of low carbon initiatives, particularly in countries like Indonesia, but we could broaden it to other Southeast Asian countries that are in a similar state? How feasible is it for them to have a green recovery from COVID?
Well, COVID certainly, I'm unmuted. COVID certainly offers an opportunity for nations to put themselves on the path toward more green energy. The question is whether nations will take that opportunity or have the ability to take that opportunity. I think that the main priority of a lot of countries is going to be economic recovery. And, often the low-hanging fruit is not green friendly. I'm not a specialist in this sector, but I think that, I would suggest that it is going to be very challenging to break the hold of carbon technologies on countries' economies. I also think things like, in the case of Indonesia, the heavy reliance on palm oil as an export crop, imposes limits to how far the country can go in fighting deforestation, which of course palm oil is one of the main contributors to. So I think that in countries like Vietnam, we've already seen certain steps toward the adoption of cleaner forms of energy. And I think that was something that predated the pandemic. And I think that it will probably continue along that track, even though, in the north of the country, Vietnam is still has greenlit coal-fired power plants. There is movement in the right direction there, and I think that will proceed. But I do think it's going to be for countries like Indonesia and the Philippines that are very, whose internal governance is very chaotic, and the lines of, the ability to plan things and carry them through to, is often impaired by the complexity of the political systems and the differing centers of power in these countries. I think that that's going to pose some challenges. But I think that with every year that goes by, the effects of climate change are becoming more and more apparent. So really, these governments, have every reason to focus on this. I just think that it's probably going to fall down the list of priorities, as the economic recession produced by the pandemic begins to take hold.
Yeah, this question was directed at Sebastian, but I think it's a good question to pose to Katie and Abhi as well, because obviously climate change is a global issue, and every country now has an opportunity to look at their growth roadmap. How are they going to recover, and a chance to make it a green one. So what are the odds of that actually happening? In Northeast Asia, we saw, China, Japan, and Korea all come out with these new plans to be net zero emissions by 2050 for Japan and Korea, and 2060 for China. So there's some steps there. So Katie, do you want to talk us through Central Asia's potential?
So I have friends in Bishkek, and they have been complaining about the smog in the winter and how bad it is these days. People report not seeing the sun some days, and so it's climate change and pollution and fossil fuels. These are all issues for all of the Central Asian countries. There's not a lot of big movement on dealing with it or finding sort of alternate sort of pathways. The major gas and oil producers in the region, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, obviously have overriding economic interests in continuing to sell oil. Kazakhstan has unrolled a number of sort of green initiatives, but I don't know terribly much about how effective those have been or how broad. And sort of every winter, most of the Central Asian countries, there are complaints about electricity shortages, which sort of pushes people to using coal and burning whatever they need to stay warm. And it's it's on repeat, and it's starting to really, really frustrate people. But I don't know that governments are taking a lot of they're clearly not taking the steps that are necessary to deal with the issues. They sort of go for the shut up the people who are complaining tactic, which doesn't solve the issue. But it's very clear. The other sort of major effect that climate change is having in Central Asia and going to continue to have is as there is less snowfall in the winter, there is less water in the summer. I think it was this summer, Tajikistan actually stopped exporting electricity to Afghanistan and Uzbekistan for a period of time and had power shortages in the summer, which is not usually what happens. It has a series of dams, and those tend to be in sort of humming operation in the summer when the water is flowing, and the reservoirs were way down, and the outlook is not great for sort of regional energy. And they had bet on hydropower as sort of the alternative, but you need water for that. And so that's the window is kind of closing for how useful hydropower is. And I don't know that there's a lot of movement towards things like solar or other alternative fuels. So that's the Central Asia version.
All right, Abhi, you have anything to add on green recovery?
Just to, Katie mentioned air quality in Bishkek. I was just reminded of what my air purifier in Delhi yesterday was saying when I went to bed. Because yes, we know bad air. Trust me when I say that. But more seriously, I think when it comes to India's imperatives, India's approach to climate change is a very tricky one, and I don't fault the Indian government for considering it to be a very tricky issue, because see, on one hand there is this imperative of global leadership. India aspires to global leadership because of the status it accrues with state leadership. So there was that driving India's negotiations towards in the COP21 and the Conference of Parties in Paris, leading up to the Paris Agreement. And so India has a rhetorical commitment, obviously, towards a green transition, green pathway for economic growth. India also, I mean, because of essentially foreign policy reasons as well, India has launched things like the Modi government has launched things like the International Solar Alliance, which is again a pathway for countries to look at renewables, to solar energy, and so on and so forth. All of this was fine till the pandemic happened, like many things. Because what I worry about now is this: how deep is India's economic crisis? Right. Of course, there is a shock from the pandemic. If this is a temporary shock, this would be fine. But if this shock essentially exacerbates existing structural problems with the economy and economic recovery, then literally becomes front and center. Can the Indian government still commit itself to very high environmental conditions, certain emission targets, and so on and so forth? Because then the imperative of economic recovery and creating jobs and making sure people have jobs, making sure manufacturing picks up, which is, by the way, a very big thing for the Modi government under the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative. When you triangulate all of this demand for the desire for prestige, COVID shock, structural problems with the economy, as well as a possible green pathway, how does one essentially square the circles? Sorry to mix all my geometry with triangles and squares, but essentially you get the point.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions now on the Uyghur issue, which is obviously incredibly important. So I want to field those. Few people have asked why the attention on the Uyghur issue seems to have intensified in 2020. Is the situation getting worse, or is something else at play? I don't know if we can say that it's getting worse. 2017, you started having people really for no legal justification, even under China's own legal system, pulled out of their homes and forcibly put in vocational education or re-education centers, depending on what term you want to use, where they are, essentially being forced to repeat Chinese government propaganda. And the Chinese government has offered all sorts of justifications for this, but if you look at the comments from your diaspora members who have had family members and some people who have actually escaped from the camps themselves, none of the explanations that China has offered really hold any water. So yeah, I don't know that we can say that it's gotten worse. It certainly hasn't gotten any better. I think what's happening is we're seeing the accumulation of the news coverage is really starting to pay off. This started happening in laying the groundwork in 2016, then things really kicked into gear in 2017, 2018 as when you started seeing the first major news coverage, and by now I think it's started to become common knowledge, and that's increasing the pressure on governments that do subscribe to the idea of universal human rights. From average people on the street now know about this issue and are starting to question why their governments aren't doing something about it. I think also the general decline in China's relationship has emboldened some governments to speak out a little bit more. And I would say that the EU is a huge example of this. Europe obviously subscribes very highly to human rights. But now you're starting to see them push back more forcefully on the Uyghur issue. And I think that's partially because there's a lot of disillusionment with China and a feeling that, all of the times that we bit our tongues and we didn't talk about the things we wanted to talk about to keep China happy, it hasn't paid off and it hasn't made a difference. So why should we keep doing it? Is sort of the attitude that you're seeing in a lot of these countries. So I think that's why we've seen a lot more news coverage of this. We've seen a lot more government statements on it. The Olympics is also coming up in early 2022. So I think we're really going to see a movement to try and have countries boycott the Beijing Olympics over largely the Uyghur issue, but also, of course, Hong Kong and just the general rights situation in China. So we also had another related question. How is this impacting China's relationship with Muslim majority states in Central Asia and Southeast Asia? And we can include South Asia in this as well, so Abhi can chime in. So Sebastian, do you want to start us out?
Sure. Well, over the past few years, as this issue's come to more and more, international attention, we've seen a modest increase in the, domestic pressure within Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia over this issue. But it hasn't really broken through in a significant way in the same way that it has in the European Union and the United States and other countries. I think one of the main reasons is that most of the nations of Southeast Asia, the governments of Southeast Asia, prioritize the norms of national sovereignty over norms of universal human rights. So, of course, there is in some sense, a tension between the two. And Southeast Asian governments have always, and this is, a legacy of their anti-colonial heritage to a large degree, have tended to shy away from criticizing other nations for what are perceived as their internal affairs. So this has made Southeast Asian governments reluctant to wade into open criticism of China. Another factor is simply the huge amount of trade and investment that these nations conduct with China. I think that nations like particularly Malaysia and Indonesia and Brunei view their relations with China in a very pragmatic light. They see China as a potential partner in the the enhancement of their infrastructure and as a an outlet for exports of various kinds. In fact, no nation in Southeast Asia does as much trade with China as Malaysia, and Malaysia also enjoys a trade surplus with China. So these nations tend to view the question of the Uyghurs in the context of the already very warm relations that they have with China, and while there is domestic pressure building in both of these countries, especially amongst sort of the more radical Islamic groups, this is not something that's as yet put significant pressure on the governments in these countries to do something about it. China has also been quite assiduous in engaging Muslim organizations in these countries to sort of and offering them inducements, if not openly, to not say anything about it, to sort of ensure that they are sort of friendly toward China and don't take up arms on this particular issue. So I think that this is likely to continue. I think that many of the nations in Southeast Asia see the question of national sovereignty in a reciprocal manner. That they will be very cautious about criticizing China out of fear of being criticized for their own human rights problems. And I think that we're likely to see them sort of hold their tongue on this question, unfortunately.
Yeah, Katie, you've written on this quite a bit, so I know you have a lot to say.
Yeah, so the governments of Central Asia have done similarly to what Sebastian outlined. The Muslim majority states in Southeast Asia have done, which is stay basically mum on the issue. They have the governments and the elites have sort of overriding economic interests in continuing good relations with China and aren't interested in necessarily mucking that up. The most sort of difficult line to walk is by Kazakhstan. In addition to Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs living in Xinjiang were also interned. And so I guess it was 2018, 2019, the Kazakh government did lobby for sort of the release of ethnic Kazakhs. And the number I saw was about 2,000, but there was never really solid reporting on who and when and what. But the sort of importance of Kazakhstan to the overall narratives and the reporting that we got really can't be overstated. A lot of Western reporters, the closest you could get to Xinjiang was going to Kazakhstan and talking to the Kazakh, the ethnic Kazakhs who were from Xinjiang. When Kazakhstan became independent in 1991, it was the titular ethnic group was not the majority in the country, and so the Kazakh government unrolled this program called the Oralman program, sort of calling to its ethnic compatriots across Eurasia to come back to Kazakhstan. They made it fairly easy to move to Kazakhstan, get Kazakh citizenship, and this kind of ended up sort of biting them in the backside when it came to not pushing China with regard to sort of the internment of these people's families. There were a lot of cross-border families. So grandparents would stay in Xinjiang, their children would move to Kazakhstan and get jobs and would go back and forth very habitually. And when the border locked down, these are the people who noticed it first. Kazakhstan has sort of walked a sort of careful line in allowing sort of some people who illegally crossed the border or illegally because their passports were taken by the Chinese authorities and they fled across the border into Kazakhstan asking for asylum, sort of allowed some of these people to come, but then didn't let them stay. A lot of them have moved on to asylum in European countries because Kazakhstan really couldn't, it wasn't going to push back against China, but it also couldn't deport them for its own domestic reasons. It was a really sort of rock and hard place position. There were also some civil society groups that formed in Kazakhstan and also Kyrgyzstan. I think Kyrgyzstan has been very much distracted by its own political turmoil, so I don't know the status of those groups now because there are also ethnic Kyrgyz interned in China, though far fewer numerically than Uyghurs and Kazakhs, just because it's a smaller population. But the overriding sort of tension is that you have sort of the elite interest and the government interest in maintaining ties with China. And for the same reason that Muslim majority countries across the world have not pushed back against China, stays the same in Central Asia. But you do have some public interest and public agitation, but the governments have been fairly sort of heavy-handed in silencing people when they get a little bit too uppity about it. And it's, you know, I was interested to see this question mostly because a lot of that sort of original reporting that we got about individuals, all of that happened in 2018 and 2019. We haven't had that in 2020 because nobody could really travel to talk to these people. So it is interesting that sort of Western governments have finally clued into what was happening and sort of are making their moves in 2020, but all of this reporting happened in 2018 and 2019. So it's sort of an interesting, you know, this has been happening for a long time, but until, you know, the United States started sanctioning people and Europe started asking questions, did you sort of see it rise to the surface again?
So Abhi, has this really come to play for the Muslim majority countries of South Asia or even India, which obviously has a sizable Muslim population?
Sure. And I think, you know, when Sebastian was describing what he saw, the outlook on this problem was in Southeast Asia, I was thinking inside my head, you know, he's talking about South Asia also. Because the factors he outlined, which is a very strong reading of a sovereignty norm, it's also at play when it comes to India, when it comes to Pakistan. And so is this, and that largely also stems, as he said, from a post-colonial tradition where sovereignty and internal sovereignty is a no-go area. So that has shaped some of this response. What is very interesting here is how India has stayed silent, right, on the Uyghur issue, on Hong Kong, both, even though the commentariat here in Delhi had urged the Indian government to speak out, especially given everything that's going on in the dark. India has not spoken out. I suspect part of it is also, again, related to something Sebastian said, which is the fear of criticism about your own conduct, right? Because we had the effective application of Article 370, which guaranteed special autonomous status to Jammu and Kashmir last year. There was a lot of blowback from certain quarters. Kashmir remains a sensitive, very sensitive area for the Indian government, and it really does not like any criticism about what's going on in Kashmir. So I think there is that kind of a tacit quid pro quo that you stay out of certain things, we'll stay out of this. That's India, right? Interestingly, with Pakistan, it's not a surprise, right? That Pakistan will stay silent. I mean, it's money, right? It's money, it's CPEC, right? It's geopolitics. But the Pakistanis need the Chinese to be needling the Indians for obvious reasons. So you have this very similar dynamics that's playing out in Southeast Asia, which is also playing out in South Asia, whether that's Uyghurs or the Hong Kong issue.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have now. It was a good discussion, guys. We covered, I think, as much ground as we could in an hour. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone who attended in the audience, and best wishes to all of us for a happier 2021. And we will see you in the new year with our next webinar. So stay tuned for information about that. Thanks.
Thanks.